those people who are determined to get rid of Rishi Sunak do see the aftermath of the local elections as their best hope of achieving that. But then, there are others that say, you know what, most voters aren't paying the sort of close attention to what's going on in Westminster politics as perhaps you and I and everyone else around us is, and they're not really, they're not. It's not really front and centre of their minds. But the one thing that would put it front and centre of their minds is if the Tories decide to change leader yet again.
Mm.
A number of MPs saying, look, it's totally mad. They're not going to think, oh, goodness me, we've got Penny Mordaunt. Maybe it's time to look at the Tories again. They're going to think, wow, they really can't decide who they want to lead them. And it will be, actually far worse than keeping with Sunak until the election.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is in Derbyshire today, where he's launching the Conservatives' campaign for the local elections, which take place on May the 2nd. Setting out his pitch, speaking to reporters a little earlier, he was contrasting the Conservatives' running of councils with that of Labour, particularly Labour's record at Birmingham City Council.
The Labour-run council has effectively bankrupted the largest local authority in Europe. Residents are facing a 21% council tax increase and a slashing of jobs and services. And in contrast to that, you've got fantastic mayors like Ben Houchen in Teesside, Andy Street in the West Midlands, and soon to be Ben Bradley here in the East Midlands, all of whom are delivering for their constituents. And that's a difference at these elections.
But Rishi Sunak's day got off to a slightly difficult start as he was launching his local election campaign with the news that West Yorkshire police are investigating the Tory donor Frank Hester, whose alleged racist comments. The businessman was reported to have said that the Labour MP, Diane Abbott, Labour MP she then was, made him want to hate all black women and should be shot. In comments he made at a meeting in 2019, he subsequently apologised for them. But it meant that Rishi Sunak's had to talk about that as well this morning. Well, joining me now is the Times' policy editor, Oliver Wright. Oliver, let's start with a straightforward question. What is the message that Rishi Sunak would like to be landing today?
The message he wants to land is that, as he puts it, voters should send a message to Keir Starmer. He's arrogantly taking the British people for granted, assuming that he can just stroll into number 10. He's basically asking voters to sort of reassess him, reassess the Tories, and ask themselves the question, do we really want 5 years of a Labour government?
So that's the message he'd like to get out. Instead, he's been sort of hampered on several fronts. First of all, the Frank Hester story. It was 10, 11 days now ago it broke in The Guardian, these comments that he'd made. He's since apologised. Rishi Sunak's called them racist. It just puts all this back up in the headlines again, doesn't it?
It does, and it's not something that Sunak would like, particularly the timing of him launching the local election campaign. I think one of the beyond Hester, one of the more interesting things about this is the way in which Sunak is emphasising less the local council elections and more the mayoral elections. Andy Street in the West Midlands, obviously, Ben Houchen in Tees Valley. Now, I think that is where the Tories think they have their best chance on May the 2nd. They think that actually with a fair wind they could hold the West Midlands, and with a fair wind they could hold Tees Valley, and then they could portray it as, you said that these election results were going to be completely disastrous for us, but we've held Birmingham, which would be a really impressive achievement, and we've held Tees Valley, so things aren't quite as bad as the pundits would have you believe.
There's been these various points. It was going to be the party conference. It was going to be the autumn statement. It was going to be the reshuffle. It was going to be the budget. They were going to turn around the party's fortunes. With these elections now looming on May the 2nd, will the chat about replacing Rishi Sunak only intensify if there is lots of losses? Or actually, by that point, are we beyond the point of no return and they're sort of stuck with him?
I think both things could be true. The chatter will certainly increase. Those people who are determined to get rid of Rishi Sunak do see the aftermath of the local elections as their best hope of achieving that. But then, there are others that say, you know what, most voters aren't paying the sort of close attention to what's going on in Westminster politics as perhaps, you and I and everyone else around us is. And they're not really, it's not really front and centre of their minds. But the one thing that would put it front and centre of their minds is if the Tories decide to change leader yet again. A number of MPs saying, look, it's totally mad. They're not going to think, oh, goodness me, we've got Penny Mordaunt. Maybe it's time to look at the Tories again. They're going to think, wow, they really can't decide who they want to lead them. And it will be, actually far worse than keeping with Sunak until the election.
Ollie, really good to speak to you. Oliver Wright there, the Times' policy editor, as Rishi Sunak launches his local election campaign today. slightly undermined by the fact that, as well as local councils being elected on May the 2nd, there were a number of big mayoralties up for grabs, as Ollie was just saying, on May the 2nd, including in Greater Manchester. But the Conservative candidate there has just defected to Reform UK. And Dan Barker, formerly of the Conservatives, now of Reform UK, joins me now. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. So why defect from a party that got 20% of the vote in Manchester last time round to a party which is doing even worse?
Well, I think you've got to look at what parties stand for. And when I got into politics just under 2 years ago, having voted Conservative my entire life, my starting point was the Conservative Party. As I stepped up another level in the party and stood for the mayoral, I then saw a different side of the party. My campaign was not supported. Whether it's winnable or not, as the opposition party in Greater Manchester, there's a duty on the Conservatives to fight the cause and hold Andy Burnham and Labour to account, which ironically I see they're now doing with the previous candidate, putting the effort into the campaign that they should have done from the very beginning. And so the reason I chose to go to Reform is that when I look at their policies and what they stand for and their key people and what they say, I see a lot more that aligns with my Conservative values.
So give me an example then of a position taken by Reform which is not taken by the Conservatives.
Well, I'll give you an example. The piece of legislation that I think has troubled me the most out of anything with the Conservative Party was putting net zero into law. I mean, whilst it's a noble aim and it's an aspiration we should aspire to as part of our commitment to the environment and climate change, with less than 1% of global emissions, we are kidding ourselves that doing this is going to make any difference. But that's one example. The other one, of course, is immigration. So I think whether it's legal or illegal, most people, if you talk to them, man or woman in the street, would say, yes, immigration is too high. And if you look at the legislation that's going through the Parliament at the moment, you know that it's not worth the paper it's written on when the immigration minister resigns before it even sets off through Parliament.
So just when did you become the Tory candidate in Greater Manchester?
So I was elected by democratic process by the membership of Greater Manchester Conservatives around November. And obviously yesterday was when I announced my move to Reform UK.
So the UK passed net zero into law in June 2019. So why is the reason that you've moved to Reform UK opposition to something that happened 4 years before you became the candidate?
Well, you asked for a couple of examples there, Matt. So I'm giving you things that didn't sit comfortably with me. And whilst net zero was passed in 2019, I think the implications on people's lives, on their finances, is really starting to bite now up and down the UK.
Would you like to see Nigel Farage come back into frontline politics? Would you like him to be leading you in to these elections, general election this year, as the leader of Reform UK?
I think Nigel would certainly be a very welcome figure, whatever role he takes, whether that's within the party or within GB News, kind of supporting the cause and holding others to account.
Doesn't this, you going to Reform UK, you probably actually bump up Reform UK's poll ratings, the publicity and the fact you were the Conservative before. Actually, you risk just splitting the vote on the right, don't you? Actually giving Andy Burnham an even bigger majority in Greater Manchester.
Well, I think it's probably a betting certainty that Andy Burnham will get re-elected within Greater Manchester, if you look at the figures. But I think what's more important is that Reform UK is on the ballot, that there's a choice, a real choice against the two main parties for voters. Because I would say that if you look at Labour and Conservatives now, there's not actually much between them. They've got very similar policies. They're in very similar space on economics, on immigration. And really, that is is managed decline for the UK, and what people want is a change.
Just one final question, Dan. Lee Anderson had previously talked about being offered money to join Reform UK, although he then said that he hadn't been when he defected. You haven't been offered any inducements from Reform UK?
Absolutely not. I mean, I can tell you now, I have not received a single pound for my campaign from the Conservatives, which is the statement I made yesterday. And I have received no incentives and no offer of any money for me personally to join Reform. And I wouldn't expect any in being in politics unless you actually hold a public office. There should be no money involved.
Dan, really good to speak to you. Really appreciate your time today. Dan Barker there, the Conservative candidate in the Greater Manchester mayoralty.